In 1816, the calendar betrayed its promises. Spring arrived like a rumor and then retreated. June mornings brought frost where seedlings should have been reaching for warm light. Markets that had always trusted the seasons found their ledgers filling with a new, anxious arithmetic. Less wheat, more hunger, higher prices. People who had never learned to measure their lives in months instead of years suddenly had to count the days between a frost and a failed harvest. For one summer, the sun seemed to have lost its duty. The air grew cold, the skies hung heavy and gray, and a world built on predictable seasons stumbled. The origin of that broken summer began 9 months earlier, on an isolated island in Indonesia. In April 1815, Mount Tambora tore itself open in one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The local violence was obvious. Pyroclastic flows, ash blanketing villages, tens of thousands of immediate casualties. But the eruption also flung its materials into the high atmosphere, where they behaved very differently from the falling ash that choked the island below. Tiny particles of sulfur combined with water high in the stratosphere to make a veil of sulfate aerosols, an airborne blanket that scattered sunlight and lingered for months, even years, instead of settling quickly to the ground. Think of that veil as a planetary dimmer switch. It did not shut the sun off, but it reduced the amount of sunlight that reached the surface, especially in the seasons following the eruption. The sulfate particles reflected and scattered incoming solar radiation and altered how heat moved through the atmosphere. Carried by high-altitude winds, these aerosols drifted across hemispheres. The immediate drama on Tambora's slopes had a remote, patient consequence: a global decline in temperature and a season of weather that refused to behave. The mechanics are simple to picture, though the atmosphere itself is not simple. A colossal plume reached the stratosphere, the layer of the atmosphere where winds can circulate long-lived particles around the planet without them being washed out by rain. There, sulfur dioxide converted into fine sulfate droplets that scattered sunlight. With less direct solar energy to warm land and ocean surfaces, surface temperatures fell. Weather systems, which depend on temperature gradients, reconfigured themselves. Storm tracks shifted, summers dried where they had once been wet, and became persistently cool and wet where summers had once been warm. And because these aerosols stayed aloft for months, the effects extended through the following growing season. The pathways of impact were not shipping lanes or trade caravans. The planet's own circulation acted as the conveyor belt. Stratospheric winds streamed the volcanic veil from the tropics into mid-latitudes, where most of the world's grain was raised. The same air that makes spring a promise carried Tambora's ghost into New England, across northern Europe, and into the monsoon systems of Asia. Where the atmosphere traveled, so too did the slow dimming of light, and the subtle reweaving of familiar weather. The first signs were local and meteorological, then became social. In parts of New England and eastern Canada, contemporary meteorological records and newspaper reports record frost and even snow in June and July. A shock in a season when farmers were accustomed to warmth and steady sun. In northern Europe, the summer of 1816 was remembered for relentless rain and chill. Fields lay sodden, seed rotted where it had been planted, and flowering was delayed or aborted. Fruit trees failed to set. Potatoes and wheat, staples of everyday diets, simply did not mature. Across regions, harvests collapsed or produced yields far below expectation. Those weather lines translated quickly into household struggles. Imagine a smallholder in the Connecticut River Valley in the early 19th century. He has a thin strip of land, a family of children, and a winter to feed for. Seed and tools are invested, livestock pastured on slender margins. He surfaces one morning to find small plants enameled with frost, leaves blackened at the edges. What was supposed to be an ordinary season to fill the cellar becomes a sequence of losses. A neighboring family sells a pig, another mortgages a parcel of land, someone else decides to set out for a city where odd jobs pay food for a few weeks. In port towns, the price of imported grain climbs as regional supplies fail. Bread lines lengthen at parish houses and municipal relief committees face impossible demand. Municipal institutions and national governments were not equipped for a suddenly global crisis. Relief systems in many places still relied on local charity and parish administration, and those systems were strained to breaking. Newspapers printed lists of crops failed and appeals for assistance. Magistrates and town selectmen argued about how to distribute grain reserves. Shipmasters hoarded rather than sold when markets wavered. In cities, the strain sometimes tipped into unrest. Markets saw short, sharp riots over bread prices. In the countryside, people who had once trusted the regular order of seasons began to question the competence of officials charged with guaranteeing food supplies. Scientists, the natural philosophers of the era, and the literate public wrestled to explain what they observed. Meteorological records, letters, and early scientific journals brimmed with hypotheses. Some contemporaries suspected an unusually prolonged phase of sunspots or the passage of a comet. Others reported a dry fog that dimmed the sun without the usual sensations of smoke. There was debate and difficulty because the idea of a single distant eruption producing a worldwide climate anomaly was not yet familiar to most. It took time for the physical mechanism, aerosols in the stratosphere scattering light, to become the consensus explanation. In the moment, people reached for what they knew: astronomical events, changes in the sun, or local misfortune. The scientific community, however, began to piece together observations from around the world and saw patterns: altered solar radiation, vivid sunsets, and a persistent cooling that linked distant places to the same source. That strangeness of light deserves mention in its own right. The volcanic veil created spectacular optical phenomena, sunsets painted with intense reds and purples, and a pall that sometimes made no direct image of the sun at all, only a dim disk. Artists and diarists recorded those unnatural skies. For many observers, the visual oddity underlined a deeper unease. The heavens had taken on an alien quality, and people's imaginations turned that sky into omen and metaphor. The cultural ripple was immediate and profound. In the summer of 1816, a group of writers and artists gathered at Lake Geneva. Torrential rains and stormy weather kept them indoors, and it was in that damp confinement that a famous ghost story emerged. Mary Godwin, later Shelley, conceived the idea that would become Frankenstein during a conversation among companions about life, electricity, and the nature of being, conversations shaped in part by the bleak weather pressing against the windows. Lord Byron wrote gloomy verse. John Polidori emerged with a tale that fed the era's appetite for Gothic themes. The dim, persistent summer had become a creative pressure chamber. The world outside was uncanny, and artists translated that uncanniness into images that would last far beyond the season. The social reactions to the year without a summer did not end with poems and tales. Food scarcity produced bread riots and demands for relief in Britain and parts of the continent. Officials in Prussia, Switzerland, and Britain recorded widespread crop failures and the need for emergency measures. In Switzerland, reported crop failures forced communities to draw on reserves and in some cases delay or alter planting schedules the following year. In parts of Italy and France, delayed harvests produced shortages that stung through the winter. Across northern Europe, poor harvests exacerbated existing vulnerabilities. The peasant and urban poor were hardest hit, while merchants and landowners faced losses in income and volatile grain prices. Migration patterns shifted too. Some families, already inclined to risk a voyage to North America, saw the cost of staying through a bad season as too high. The promise of new land and the chance to restart in a place where different climatic patterns might prevail nudged decisions already complicated by economic strain. In North America, too, communities recorded an influx of migrants in the years following 1816, part economic calculation and part desperate search for subsistence. All of these effects, cultural, economic, demographic, were mediated by the communication networks of the day. Newspapers spread news and rumor. Letters and journals carried accounts across oceans. That same interconnectedness meant local shocks were no longer merely local. They fed regional markets and cross-border perceptions. The year without a summer revealed how porous the globe was to environmental influence, and how social systems that assumed local predictability could fail under a planetary climate perturbation. That failure showed up in policy too. Governments confronted with the political risk of hungry, Restless populations altered their approaches. Some tried to stabilize markets through grain imports and price controls. Others invested more in mapping weather and collecting data. The event helped stimulate interest in meteorology as a discipline. Observers, including some of the early meteorological societies and natural philosophers, began to compile systematic weather records. In the longer view, the crisis nudged the public and authorities toward an appreciation that distant natural events could cascade into local crises, a lesson with implications for agricultural planning and for nascent global policy thinking. At the individual level, stories lingered. Consider a composite vignette drawn from multiple first-hand accounts. Hannah, a farm wife in a New England township, watches the potato rows blacken after a late June frost. Her husband, who once bartered wood for flour with neighboring towns, finds that grain boats are scarce and costly. They spend the summer patching old cloth for sale and going to the parish for a sack of flour. Her eldest son, seeing no inheritance worth tending, signs on for a ship sailing to Lake Erie in search of land. These are not apocalyptic scenes, but accumulations of small losses and choices that change ordinary lives. The sum of these decisions, migration, sale of tools, a child leaving home, echoes across generations. Historians now argue about the longer-term demographic and economic effects of 1816. Some regions recovered quickly, others endured years of below-average yields that reshaped local economies. The increased price of grain benefited some landowners, but impoverished laborers and tenants. Credit tightened. Poor households borrowed against future harvests that might never come. For many, 1816 was a shock that revealed the limits of household resilience. It is tempting when looking back to read the event as a moral or teleological lesson, a punishment, a cleansing, or a portent. But contemporary responses were more pragmatic than providential. Clergy offered sermons about patience and providence. Some people made moral sense of misfortune through theology. Yet for many others, the focus was on immediate solutions: how to import cheap grain, where to find seed, how to prevent the family from going hungry that winter. Religion, science, and policy intermingled in the public conversation, but the material problem remained stubbornly concrete. Cold and wet destroy crops. Food must be bought or rationed. The year without a summer also had surprising ecological consequences. In some regions, agricultural setbacks led to shifts in cropping choices, of temporary moves to less risk-prone foodstuffs, or to technological experimentation in planting and storing. Millers and merchants reassessed supply chains. Some localities doubled down on communal granaries or rotated planting strategies to diversify risk. In the longer arc, these incremental adjustments contributed to evolving agricultural practices in the 19th century. When we raise Tambora and 1816 in a modern context, the parallels are instructive rather than deterministic. The eruption was a natural experiment in global climate forcing, a powerful but relatively short-lived perturbation with immediate and uneven consequences. Today we live with different forcings and systems. Greenhouse gases warming the planet over decades rather than aerosol opacities cooling it for a season. Still, the principle that a physical shock can transmit globally through atmospheric and economic networks is the same. The year without a summer exposes how assumptions of stability, that a harvest will come, that supermarkets will be stocked, that a municipal poor relief system will suffice, can be fragile. That fragility is not an argument for fatalism. It is an argument for humility and preparedness. The event shows the value of better observation, of networks that can distribute resources swiftly, and of institutions capable of absorbing shocks without transferring the worst burdens to the most vulnerable. It also shows something less technical, but equally important: how human culture responds to unmoored seasons. In dreary parlors and candlelit rooms, people converted anxiety into myth, into poetry, into tales that have shaped our cultural memory ever since. To return to Lake Geneva for a moment, the small circle of weary, bored, and restless guests that summer did not create a global pattern, but they did capture its mood. The storms pressed them inward. Conversation turned to the nature of animated life. That inward turn yielded a story about a maker and a creation that has haunted imaginations ever since. A reminder that catastrophe changes not only material well-being, but the stories we tell about existence. In that sense, the year without a summer became both a historical crisis and a cultural crucible. As documentary evidence accumulated over the 19th and 20th centuries, the consensus about Tambora's role in 1816 hardened. Modern climate science, the study of aerosols, radiative forcing, and atmospheric circulation, has confirmed the plausibility of the chain. A large tropical eruption can send sulfur into the stratosphere and cool surface climates for seasons to years. Historical meteorological records, agrarian accounts, price lists, and migration documents together trace the social texture of that cooling. The event therefore stands as an emblem of how a single geophysical shock can ripple outward into diet, migration, art, and policy. What then should we remember? First, the year without a summer was not a single type of disaster. It was meteorological, agricultural, economic, and cultural all at once. Second, its consequences were uneven. Some places bore heavy burdens, others were scarcely touched. Third, it revealed an interdependence between the physical world and social systems that is easily forgotten in ordinary times. And finally, it gave us, both in grim practice and in art, a language for thinking about how sudden environmental change reorders everyday life. If this story of a dimmed sun and a reshaped summer has caught your interest, stay with us. We'll trace the ash cloud across the globe and follow its impacts from market to parlor to policy table. There are still subtle lessons in that old gray sky. Modern societies have far more elaborate infrastructures and global safety nets than small parishes and town selectmen did in 1816. Yet modern infrastructures are also highly interdependent. Food distribution networks, fuel supplies, and financial markets are tightly woven across regions. A shock in one place can be amplified elsewhere through trade, logistics, and shared expectations. The year without a summer reminds us that vulnerability often hides behind the appearance of abundance. It is a cautionary tale. Build redundancy, pay attention to early warning, and invest in systems that protect those with the least margin for error. At the human level, the scene that repeats through many accounts is not a single catastrophe, but a string of human decisions under pressure. A magistrate choosing which parish receives a grain allotment, a family deciding whether to sell tools to buy flour, a writer choosing to turn inward and convert dread into a story. Those everyday choices, taken together, shaped the historical aftermath. The sunlight returned in the calendars that followed. Crops recovered in many places, merchants adjusted to volatility, and the images of that summer endured more in legend and art than in continuous deprivation. Yet the memory persisted in weather journals, in populations moved across continents, and in literature that turned atmospheric melancholy into narratives of creation and loss. The year without a summer was at once an environmental event and a social lens. It showed how a planet that seems stable can be interrupted, and how quickly established routines, planting, harvesting, market cycles, migratory patterns, can be thrown into uncertainty. We live in an age in which climate shocks take different forms and timescales. Tambora teaches us the consequences of thinking of the atmosphere as mere backdrop, rather than as an active partner in human history. If this episode moved you, please like and share so more people can learn how fragile rhythms can be, and how important it is to watch them closely. Watch our next episode for a deeper dive into the science behind volcanic aerosols and how modern monitoring systems have changed what it means to be warned. Thank you for joining this look into 1816, a year when the sun dimmed and the world found itself measuring not only bread and seed, but stories and resilience. I'm your host. Until next time, keep watching the weather and the ways it shapes our lives.